Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 118. Like the Renaissance, the Reformation is a topic that you can't handle in just a few minutes. It was a vast and complex movement with many nuances and issues. In no way, shape, or form was it homogeneous or characterizable by a few simple qualities. The reformers themselves varied widely in what they believed and, in many cases, disliked each other almost as much as they did their Roman Catholic antagonists. A true picture of the Reformation has been badly clouded by oversimplified, glowing accounts on the Protestant side and misrepresentation on the Roman Catholic side. Popular movies, inspirational children's biographies, and devotional materials haven't helped matters. If you're on the Protestant side of the fence, which by the way I am, you've probably grown up thinking of the Reformation in very black-white terms. Martin Luther thunders, "Here I stand," refusing to yield, while the Roman Catholic authorities readied their bonfires. But the actual history just isn't that simple. Martin Luther did some great things, but he was also anti-Semitic in his later life, something I find biblically unconscionable. And some of those on the Roman Catholic side were men of deep, if misguided, conviction. Both sides committed what today we'd regard as atrocities, and nobody got everything right. So how do we sift through this vast sandbox, staying as objective as possible and yet managing to learn something useful? As I did with the Renaissance, I'm going to make a few simple points and then focus on what happened to the English Bible during this period of history. But rest assured, in a future podcast series, we're going to deal with this subject in much greater depth. And I promise you we'll examine it, warts and all. Point number 1. The Reformation was not a single, well-organized movement. Many different people influenced its activities, and their motivations and goals varied widely. Some were disgusted by the Church's moral failures and greed. They felt that a reformation should correct these problems, but that the Church's doctrines were largely sound. Others had come to see the Church's doctrines as badly corrupted by centuries of error corroding the original apostolic teaching. These felt the true doctrine needed to be rediscovered and put back into practice. Opinion as to how this was to be accomplished varied among the different reformers. Some were moderate in the doctrinal reforms they proposed, while others essentially wanted to wipe the slate clean and start over. A third group wanted reform more for political and nationalistic reasons than because they cared about morality or doctrine. As you recall from our discussion of John Wycliffe, nationalism was on the rise in the late Middle Ages and had influenced religious matters already. By the 16th century, it had become a force to be reckoned with. Those in this camp saw the expanding Reformation as a means to consolidate their power, form advantageous alliances, or topple political rivals. Of course, we must remember that most reformers probably had all three of these elements in their thinking. While one probably took priority, it's unlikely that the other two were entirely absent. Point number 2. The Reformation manifested many qualities, and these varied by region as well as the personalities that influenced the region. But one factor was fairly consistent amongst many of the reformers: a recognition that they needed to go back to the Scriptures and base what they did on them. Several key reformers came to salvation by faith in Jesus Christ as a result of studying the Scriptures. Luther read Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 4, which is reiterated in Romans chapter 1 verse 17, and learned of justification by faith. Tyndale read Erasmus's Greek New Testament and came to the truth. While there were many peripheral issues going on in the Reformation, the Scriptures had a central role. It is for this reason that a number of men concluded that the Bible had to become readily available in the languages of common use. For this reason, they promoted and produced new translations in the major European languages. We call these vernacular translations. The original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek texts were once vernaculars. Later on, Latin was a vernacular. The Reformers' desire to produce new translations was consistent with history and God's plan for His Word. After all, God Himself reminds us in Romans chapter 10, verse 17, "So faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ." Several of the Reformers made this discovery and felt that the Bible needed to become widely accessible. They also understood that once people began to read the Bible, they would recognize the contrast between what it said and what the church was doing and teaching. And this leads us to the third point, which addresses a very important question. How much did the Roman Catholic Church oppose Bible translation into vernacular languages? A common assumption in Protestant circles is that the Roman Catholic Church actively opposed vernacular translations in an effort to suppress the Scriptures. Unfortunately, this view is an oversimplification and not completely accurate. As we've already discussed, vernacular translations did exist prior to the Reformation. We've looked at the Old English translations, and French and Slavic language Bibles also existed. The Roman Catholic Church did not monolithically oppose Bible access. In fact, some priests did read the Scriptures to their congregations in the local vernacular. Attitudes varied considerably by region and depended heavily upon the local authorities as well as the current hierarchy's attitude. It's fairer to say that the Roman Catholic Church was not particularly interested in making the Scriptures accessible and did relatively little to make Bibles everyday objects. This attitude was fueled by several motives. First of all, producing books prior to printing was a tedious process. People in general did not see any kind of book as commonplace, and most book owners had to be somewhat well-to-do. Secondly, there was a concern that the Bible in the hands of ordinary people would lead to misinterpretations of the Scriptures, spawning heresies. It was also believed by many that the Bible among the masses would stimulate a general unrest toward the established religious and political order. Since some reformers also held strong political views, this worry was not entirely unfounded. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which we mentioned during our discussion of John Wycliffe, is one example. Although Wycliffe did not approve of the revolt, its key ringleader, a priest named John Ball, quoted Wycliffe, creating an association between the revolt and Wycliffe's ideas. Finally, the Church did see itself as the keeper and interpreter of the Scriptures. The term magisterium refers to the authority of the Church to teach through its hierarchy of clergy. Making Bibles available to the clergy was considered sufficient. Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 8 demonstrates that this tendency is pretty common in any religious hierarchy. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called Rabbi by men. But do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers." Some of you may be wondering, why then was there so much persecution of Bible translators during the Reformation? There were three key reasons. First of all, the translations produced by the Reformers were unauthorized, produced without the sanction of the Church. Remember the Church's reaction to Wycliffe's Bible. Nobody really objected to the text itself, since it was a fairly unbiased translation from Latin to Middle English. But the religious authorities objected to Wycliffe's end run around them, so his translation was deemed tainted. On the other hand, when Erasmus wanted to produce a new Latin version of the Bible with an included Greek text, he requested permission from both the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Both approved his project, so it went forward without opposition. Even when it became fuel for reform movements and the source text for vernacular translations, it remained in print. Remember, it went through 5 editions in Erasmus's lifetime. It's worth noting that when William Tyndale wanted to produce an English translation of the New Testament, he tried going the authorized route first by asking for permission from the Bishop of London. Only when the bishop refused did Tyndale go rogue and produce an unauthorized version on his own. We can see this concept at work in the term authorized version, by which the King James Version is sometimes known. These aren't just words. They stress the fact that the translation had full royal sanction. If you, like me, are an American, or if you live in a country with a similar heritage and political philosophy, you're probably finding this whole idea of needing permission to publish a little bewildering. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press has been a part of our culture for so long, it's hard to imagine a world in which people actually cared what you wrote or said. Putting your life on the line for a book seems like something from another world, which indeed it was. This is one of those aspects of historical study that you have to accept on trust rather than on experience. To better understand the climate in which the Reformation unfolded, think of life in present-day North Korea, Iran, or Saudi Arabia. That's a closer approximation to life in the 16th century than anything in our present-day Western world. A second reason for persecution was that many of the reformers were active opponents of the Roman Catholic Church. Their translations were seen as weapons used to promote their views, which in a way they were. It's hardly surprising that the Church would respond to those weapons with the weapons at its disposal. Finally, the translation's word choices and marginal notes were often deliberately Protestant in tone. Tyndale's vocabulary, for example, deliberately steered the text away from long-held attitudes about the Church. The famous Geneva Bible is another good example. Its marginal notes were so strongly reform-based that the Church of England rejected it as a candidate for an authorized version, despite its overall popularity. The King James Version came about in part as a reaction against the highly biased Geneva Bible. Rather than seeing the Roman Catholic Church as the enemy of the Scriptures, it is probably more balanced to see the Church as increasingly negligent of the Scriptures and definitely hostile to reform. Unfortunately, this shows the principle of sowing and reaping all too graphically. The early Church failed to prioritize the Scriptures. Remember how long it took for the canon to be established? Had the Church put more effort into formalizing the Scriptures and then making them available, is it possible that the doctrinal errors that became Roman Catholicism might have been avoided? We'll never know, and as I've mentioned before, historical study shouldn't include too much time exploring what-ifs. But it's not too much of a stretch to suggest that we can learn a lesson from this. Neglect the Bible, make it inaccessible to people, and doctrinal failure will follow. And on that cautionary note, we end for today. Next time, we're going to look at the English Reformation and at the first printed English Bible. We'll see how innovative it was and how it was the beginning of many of the Bibles that we still use today. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon, and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.